Who? Me? I think we've all at some point in our lives asked those two questions when we've been called upon to do some kind of chore that we thought we weren't up to or that we didn't particularly want to do. And we had to learn a lesson, I think, probably on many occasions, and that is that with God's help, we can do what He expects of us. Before we look at some examples, including the two from Scripture that Jean read, I would like to take one that's outside the Scriptures, and very definitely, and deals with the sporting world. Now, except for Jean and Mark and Dottie, is there anybody else here who knows who John Kruk is? Okay, who's John Kruk? John Kruk played for the Phillies. A very good player, wasn't he, some years back. What's he do now? Yeah, he's a commentator for the Phillies when they play. He doesn't get to comment during the playoff season, but during the full season he did. He also is a fellow with a sense of humor, one of the things I've particularly enjoyed. A story from when he was playing. He was in the All-Star game one year, and he was called upon to pinch hit. Now, the pitcher that he would have to face was a guy named Randy Johnson. Anybody ever hear him? 6 feet 10 inches tall, left-handed pitcher, could throw a blazing fastball, and a fellow that big, by the time he let go of the ball, it looked like, I guess, it was right there. So John Kruk was not real anxious. It was obvious as he walked slowly to the plate to take his turn. First pitch, strike one. Second pitch, right down the plate, strike two. Well, John stepped back for a minute there and composed himself, then stepped up the plate again. The third pitch was not right down the plate. It was about 3 feet over John Kruk's head. John swung at it anyway and walked back to the bench. Everybody enjoyed that. Everybody laughed, the catcher, the umpire, even Randy Johnson, who took his work very, very seriously, for those of you that remember him. But there was a case where we can think of a fellow that was quite reluctant to do what, in this case, the manager of his team asked him to do. Let's take a look at the scriptural examples here in a more serious note. And let's take a look at the Old Testament first. Moses, of course, as I'm sure you know, as a baby, was put by his mother in a basket in the bulrushes. She hoped to save him from the death which the Pharaoh of Egypt had ordered for all the Hebrew boy children. And she succeeded with God's help. And Moses was found, as we know, by Pharaoh's daughter, and she raised him as her own son. And he became a prince for a while until he saw an Egyptian abusing two Hebrews. Remember that the Hebrews were slaves at this time to the Egyptians. And Moses killed the Egyptian. And then he had to flee for his life. He fled to the land of Midian, which would be today somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula. And he became a herdsman, sheep herder, for a man who would be his uncle, or not his uncle, his father-in-law, Laban. I'll get it after a bit. And it was while he was herding out there in the solitude of the Sinai Peninsula that God appeared to him, spoke to him, as Jean read there. And you notice there what God wanted him to do. I want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to go and tell old Pharaoh, as the spiritual goes, to let my people go. And Moses, of course, reacted by saying, "Who, me? Me do that? I'm an outlaw in Egypt. If I get back there, they'll kill me." "No, they won't. No, they won't," God tells him. But, and this is the part Gene read, if you recall, Moses said, "I'm no speaker. Even if Pharaoh will listen to me, he's not going to, if he lets me live, he's not going to listen to what I have to say. It'll take me too long to get it said. I won't be effective in how I do it." And God said, "I'll be with you. I'll help you make your case." And Moses continued to press. He said, "I'm not an eloquent speaker." And of course, God got impatient, got mad, and he says, "Your brother Aaron can talk for you. You tell him what to say, and he'll say it. Again, I will be with you." So Moses, in spite of saying, "Who, me?" in several ways, and making excuses, winds up, of course, doing what God wants him to do. In the New Testament, there are two men in the book of Acts named Ananias. One's a bad guy, and one's a good guy. The one we're looking at, that Gene read about, is a good guy. We don't know much about him. We know that he lived in the old city of Damascus in Syria. That city still exists today. Still a troubled place very much now. We don't know what Ananias did for a living. We know he was a Christian. We know he was a follower of the faith, a follower of Jesus. And so he quite willingly answered when Jesus spoke to him and called him by name and said, "I have something I want you to do." "What is it, Lord?" "Ananias, there is a man staying in a house on street," I'll get it said too, we had to work on it, Street, and his name is Saul of Tarsus. He's expecting you. I want you to come, lay hands on him, and heal him, because I have great work for him to do. And Ananias, kind of said, "Who, me?" to that one, because he said, "Well, Lord, I've heard a lot about this fellow Saul of Tarsus. He's a bad guy. He's had a lot of people, Christians, arrested. He's had a lot of people jailed. And in fact, I've heard that he's coming here to Damascus to arrest a number of people. He has warrants from the high priest down in Jerusalem to arrest these followers of the way." In other words, Ananias is saying, "I'm scared to go see this guy. And two, does he deserve Christians' help here to be cured of his blindness?" He's very, very hesitant. Notice also that the Christians had a network here. The fact that they knew Saul was coming for the purpose of arresting some of them. That word had already gotten to Damascus. Well, Jesus, if you recall, said, "I have great works for Saul to do. You're the fellow that's going to make it possible for him to do it. I want you to go and lay hands on him." And you notice what Ananias does. It says it very simply in Acts. So Ananias went. No further arguments, no complaints, no "who, me?" He went. And notice what else. As he laid hands on Saul of Tarsus, he says, "Brother Saul." Now here's a man that has been responsible for a lot of bad things for Christians. Remember, he held the coats of the men who threw the stones that killed the first martyr in the church, Stephen. But because Jesus has told him, "This is what I want you to do, I will help you do it," Ananias puts his hand on Saul. Saul is healed instantly. Scale-like things fall from his eyes. He can see. He becomes baptized, and eventually Saul of Tarsus, of course, is going to become the great missionary Paul. And he's going to do some great things. Perhaps if we had to pick anybody other than Jesus himself in the New Testament who accomplished things for Christianity, it would be Paul. So here's a case where, again, Ananias keeps the faith. And in answer to that question, who, me? It's yes, you. Down through the centuries, Christians have been called upon many times to do things that might be pretty tough. Again, and some of you have heard this from me before, if you don't want to hear it again, just do that. But when this particular church was built, the original part of it where we're sitting, a lot of the work was done by the members of the church themselves. The ladies of the church, besides providing that beautiful stained glass window, they also held fundraisers of various kinds. Suppers, dinners, quilt auctions, things like this to raise money to help pay for this building so they could move down here from the old church up at the cemetery, which was no longer big enough for the congregation. So they're going to do a great deal of work. A lot of the men, of course, are going to work too, and these are just ordinary, down-to-earth fellas, farmers, harness makers, shoemakers, you name it. They are people doing rather humble tasks here. And again, many of them help with the basic work of doing the church. For example, some of the young men and teenage boys were given the job of digging out the dirt that would provide for a basement here. They would take that dirt and take it out to nearby fields and dump it, and then they would bring back field stones, which became the foundations of the church. The last two men alive, as far as I know, who helped with that were Nadine's grandfather and Jen and my grandfather. They were brothers, Ralph and Walter Watterson. And I remember my grandfather, Walter Watterson, talking about that and how it was an honor to help with it. But, it was a humble job. It was one that was important, and it was one they did with God's help. So certainly we can note that as well as far as what people do. A later example, since I've given my grandfather Watterson a look here, I better give equal time to my grandfather Simmons. Our Simmons grandparents and our dad, when he was just a boy, joined this church in 1927. And whether it was at that same time or shortly before or shortly after, our grandfather was asked to be a member of the Board of Trustees. Now, the Simmons family had come up here after the First World War in 1920 out of the hills of West Virginia. They were looking for some level farmland. Just before coming up here, they had moved over from Pendleton County, West Virginia to Highland County, Virginia. And in Highland County, Virginia, my grandfather worked for a fellow by the name of Stuart Peterson. Now the Windells and some more of you folks who have been longtime residents of this area, you know Stuart Peterson? Have you heard that name? Okay, yeah. Out the off Route 10, out the Friendship Church Road, and our grandparents and our dad stayed with them. My grandfather was their hired man, and during that time, in the early 1920s, they attended Friendship Methodist Church. Then, however, my grandfather wanted to get a place of his own to farm, to make his own decisions. So they never did buy a place, but they did rent two different farms. The first one on Route 10, it was called in their time the Bill Cochran Place. Some of the Cochrans that founded Cochranville. Doug Lapp, I think, still lives there, as far as I know. And then once they moved there, they were closer to Cochranville, and so they joined eventually this church. They moved a little closer in the late 1930s to the Gibbs farm. which is the first farm on the right going out Route 10 from Cochranville. They rented that and farmed it for the next 20 years. But the point of all this is that they were strangers when they joined the church. And they were Southerners in an area where Southerners were not particularly widely found at that point. There were some that had moved in, a few, after the First World War, mostly from Highland County, Virginia. For those of you who are from Highland Township, Chester County, Pennsylvania. But in any case, I don't know whether my grandfather hesitated, whether he had to think about this a while. He was new. He was, at some points, a somewhat shy person, but he agreed to it. He agreed to be a trustee, and he served faithfully in that job for 35 years until his death in 1962. So for all of us, again, there are jobs that we can take, that we can fill, that we might at first think we're not up to. And this is certainly true today. It has been a tradition of the Methodist Church, and continues to be, that lay people help with the operation of the church, whether it's helping with the service, as some of us are doing today, or whether it's fixing up the church, doing the maintenance and the service, as some, particularly of the fellows sitting here, do, or something that involves cooking, which, well, a few of the fellows get involved, I guess, but mostly the ladies do that. The music, of course, which is a very, very important part of the service. All kinds of things here that we do. Most important of all of these chores that we set out to do, many of them perhaps we felt that at first we couldn't do, we weren't up to it. But once we tried, we found out with God's help we could, that we could do it. And the most important task of all, and the one we most likely might feel, who, me, is to help lead other folks to Christ. And we find out that's the most important thing we can do, and that's the thing that God can do most of all to help us, and that is to lead us to do that. When God calls, He wants us. He wants us, no matter how humble our abilities might be. And He will give us the power and the strength to carry out whatever His purpose is. If you look at the Bible and you look down through history, an awful lot of people of somewhat humble abilities, including a lot of us here, have been called by Jesus to do things, and we might hesitate at first, but we wind up doing them. In spring of 1960, I was a freshman in college. Herb Gill, whom some of you remember fondly as I do, was then the Sunday school superintendent. And he said to me, there's something I would like you to do. Well, what's that? I'd like you to teach a Sunday school class. Well, I thought I could do that. Which one is it? Junior high girls. Oh boy, that's something else. I was in that big room down the hall there, and I shared it with Morris Alexander. He taught the junior high boys in one corner, I taught the junior high girls in another. And I thought, boy, I don't know how this is going to work or not, whether I'll be able to stick with this. Well, 60 years later, I keep trying to do it. So sometimes when God calls us, it turns out not only can we do it, and it's helpful, but also we enjoy it. And let's all keep trying to do that.